Dorian's chair hit the glass wall before Conrad finished reading. The crack cut through the room like something structural failing. His face, the face of a man who believed he had already won, came apart completely. What was left wasn't grief. It was a trapped fury of a man watching the only exit close while he was still standing inside. He pointed at the document in Conrad's hand. His fingers shook. "Who is that?" His voice was tight. "Who is Cale Morrow-Briggs?" I didn't answer. I looked at my hands on the table. Across from me, Suzanne had gone completely still, her coffee cup set down with precision that looked like her last control movement. Her face had no color left. Dorian said one word, "Friday," barely above a breath, like something tearing at a seam. Conrad placed 2 sealed envelopes on the table. Neither of them reached forward. I looked up and said, "Let him finish reading." I had known what was in that room for 11 months. I had spent every one of those months making sure there was nothing left in it for either of them to take. If you're already shocked by what you just witnessed, you're not alone. Subscribe to this channel and drop a comment telling me where you're watching from. I want to know this story is reaching people who understand. Now, let me tell you how I got here. My name is Walter Briggs, 63 years old, born in Wolverhampton in a terrace house where the bathroom didn't work until I fixed it myself at 11. I left school at 16, night school for 4 years after that. At 31, I started Briggs Civil and Construction from a one-room office above a chip shop with £4,000 and a second-hand desk I carried upstairs myself. 40 years later, $6.8 million in the company, $2.1 in property, $890,000 in investments. Total estate, £9.4 million. I'm not telling you this to impress you. I'm telling you so you understand exactly what was on that table in Canary Wharf and what my children were planning to do with it while I lay in a hospital bed watching the door stay closed. I had told everyone I had 2 children for 34 years. The truth was I had 3. It was a Tuesday morning in October when my chest decided it had been patient long enough. I sat down carefully, the way you do when your body gives you just enough warning to choose where you land. Then I rang for the ambulance myself, because there was no one else in the house. 2 weeks in the cardiac unit, 9 weeks in rehabilitation in Edgbaston, a window facing a garden I watched change from autumn gold to bare winter gray. Both children knew within 4 hours. My assistant Marion rang them both herself. I spent the first week telling myself they were coming. The second week, I told myself there were reasons. By week 3, I had stopped explaining it and started noting it. The way you note a crack in a wall when you're deciding what needs to be done. 11 weeks, 0 visits, not one knock on that door. What they did instead, I would only discover later, slowly, and then all at once. Dorian didn't come to the hospital to visit. He came to help, which was a different thing. He sat across from my solicitor Conrad Hale in Canary Wharf with a legal pad and the attentive expression of a concerned son. He asked the right questions, used the right language. Conrad had no reason to distrust any of it. What Dorian didn't mention was that 3 weeks before my cardiac event, he had already met Colton Marsh, a financial advisor with Mayfair address and a quiet history of finding creative arrangements for clients whose situations required flexibility. Over my 11 weeks in hospital, for meetings with Marsh produced advisory, restructuring documents. Each one, read alone, looked routine. Read together. They were a complete rewiring of my estate, using my power of attorney as a key and my trust in my son as the oil that kept every lock open. Suzanne didn't need the money the way Dorian needed it. That distinction was what made her version harder to sit with. She ran a lifestyle brand called Sutton and Briggs. The Sutton had left 18 months earlier, but the name tested better. 94,000 Instagram followers. A Notting Hill flat on a mortgage she paid inconsistently. Over 4 years, her expenses had consumed approximately 8 months of my company's net profit, filed under business development. My assistant Marion flagged it twice. I waved it through both times because she was my daughter. The brand looked successful the way a freshly painted wall looks solid. You had to press it to find the damp underneath. She and Dorian had the nursing home conversation in November, while I was 6 weeks into rehabilitation. They had identified a facility in Solihull. Monthly fee of £4,800. Funded by liquidating my first commercial property on Maple Lane. They attended the viewing together and said nothing to me at all. I didn't learn about the debt until Paulette Sheridan laid it on my kitchen table. 2 private lenders. The first registered in Cyprus. The second had no registration. Paulette could locate in 3 days of searching, which told me more than any document could have. Total outstanding, £280,000. Interest compounding at the rate that only exists in agreements between desperate men and the men who profit from that desperation. The Friday deadline Dorian had whispered to himself in that conference room, like a prayer with nowhere to go, had already been extended 3 times. Each extension cost more than the last. These were not men who sent polite letters. Dorian had been telling them for 3 months that the matter was nearly resolved. He believed it completely, because in his mind the transfer was imminent and Friday was simply a date already moving in his direction. He had no idea that Paulette had been sitting in my kitchen for 6 weeks, going through every document from the past 2 years, 1 page at a time. The file Paulette placed in front of me wasn't thick. It didn't need to be. Morrow Groundworks and Civil Limited registered in Coventry. Director, Cale Morrow. Date of birth, 14th of March, a date I had known for 34 years. 7 employees. A leased yard in Foleshill. 2 second-hand excavators with a company name in slightly uneven letters. The way letters are when a man paints his own name because he can't yet afford to pay someone else. Annual turnover, $380,000 in a good year. 3 months behind on the yard lease. Paulette placed a second document beside the profile. A tender submission for a drainage subcontract in Warwickshire worth £340,000. The kind of contract that changes the shape of a small company permanently. The rejection letter was 2 sentences. Preferred supply chain arrangements already in place. I looked at the name of the main contractor. Briggs Civil and Construction Ltd. My company. My name on the rejection letter from my own son's most important bid. I had to sit down. I am going to tell you something I hadn't told another person in 34 years. I had a son before Dorian, and Suzanne existed in my life. His name was Cale. His mother was Patricia, Patty, and I met her on a site in Coventry at 24. We were together for 4 years. Cale was born when I was 29. I was not a bad man in that period. I was simply not present in the way a man must be when a family is what he has. I left when Cale was 8. 1 year later, Patricia died, a brain aneurysm without warning. Cale was 9 years old and had no one. He went into foster care in Coventry. I visited once. I sat across from my son for 45 minutes in a room with plastic chairs. He was small. He was careful. He didn't cry. He had already decided that composure was a survival tool. I left. I told myself I would come back. I did not come back. I drove to Coventry on a Tuesday morning and found the site off the A444. I parked in the yard entrance and sat in my car for 22 minutes. I watched my son to the windscreen. Hard hat, work boots, a clipboard held with the natural authority of a man who had always known exactly what he was doing on this ground. He built all of this without me, without my name, without my money, without a single thing I could have offered and chose not to give. I got out of the car. He walked toward me with the wariness of someone who had learned that unexpected arrivals cost something. He stopped 3 feet away. For just a moment, something crossed his face that was older than anger. Then his expression closed. "Mr. Briggs," he said. "Not Dad, not Walter. Mr. Briggs." I deserved that. I told him I had something to explain. He said he had a site meeting in 40 minutes. I took 19 minutes and said everything that needed saying. Then I walked back to my car. 6 days after my visit, Cale rang Conrad Hale. Not me, Conrad. 2 questions, both legal and precise. The questions of a man who had taught himself to read small print because no one was ever going to read it for him. Conrad answered both. A silence. Then, "All right, tell me what I need to sign." While that call happened, Paulette was finishing her report. The patience of a woman who had spent 25 years at HMRC finding things people were certain could not be found. The power of attorney was a foundation of everything Dorian had built. Signed by me in my hospital bed, because Marion said it was standard. That single signature was the key to every door that followed. Dorian had used it with Marsh to reassign account authorities and redirect investment discretion during my recovery. None of it was forgery. It was exploitation, carried out with documents that looked routine and were anything but. Conrad and I met on a Wednesday morning in his Canary Wharf office. I told him what I wanted to build. He listened without interrupting. When I finished, he asked 4 questions, exactly the right 4. He picked up his pen. We spent 3 hours constructing the Morrow Briggs settlement, a discretionary trust with Conrad as trustee. The company went in. The properties went in. The investment accounts went in. £9.4 million moved out of my direct estate into a structure that Dorian's power of attorney, which I revoked quietly 2 weeks later, could not touch. I named the successor trustee. Conrad wrote the name carefully. Cale Morrow Briggs. He read it back. I said yes. That was the moment. In a quiet office on a Wednesday morning, everything Dorian had spent 26 months building became worthless. He didn't know it yet. He wouldn't know it for 6 months. 6 months of counting money that had already been moved somewhere he would never reach. Paulette found Colton Marsh's history in 3 days. Not a criminal record. A pattern. 17 elderly clients across 6 years. Every one of them had their estate structure modified during a period of reduced capacity. Illness, bereavement, disruption. Every modification legally sound. Every explanation delivered at the exact moment when scrutiny was most difficult. Marsh was very good at identifying the window of vulnerability in a person's life and moving through it before it closed. Paulette prepared a referral for the Financial Conduct Authority. 17 clients. £23 million in improperly restructured assets. Inside Marsh's file copy, attached to my documents, not meant to be seen, was a handwritten note. For words. DB motivated. Will hold. Motivated. That was one word for it. If you're still watching this, please subscribe, because somehow it gets even worse from here. I wish I was exaggerating. The email from Sunrise Care Solutions had been sitting in my inbox for 6 months before I found it by accident. A confirmed provisional booking. My name as the resident. Start date 3 weeks after my discharge. Monthly fee of £4,800. Funded by the liquidation of Maple Lane. The email thanked Dorian for attending the viewing. The element that stopped me wasn't the money. It was the date. 4 days before my discharge. Dorian had used my power of attorney to obtain my discharge timeline and calculate how much time he had before his plan needed its next phase. I came home on a Thursday. The booking lapsed the following Tuesday. I said nothing. I created a folder on my desktop and named it Evidence. I rang Suzanne that evening. She asked how I was feeling, mentioned a brand partnership, said we should have dinner. I said yes, that would be nice. I meant neither word. I asked Diane Forsyth to pull the Warwickshire tender file. The submission was 41 pages. Pricing methodology, program analysis, risk register, supply chain detail, references. All of it prepared to the standard I would have expected from a company 3 times the size of Morrow Groundworks. The references describe the same qualities in the same language. The language used when it's true and not when it's been coached. I read the covering letter last. 1 page. Cale Morrow's signature. Clean, no hesitation. Diane said, "We should have given him the work, Walter." I said, "I know." She said, "Someone made sure we didn't." Dorian had used his advisory authority to identify a small Coventry operator as a problem for the audit sensitivity of the current period. The estimator acted on it without understanding the context. Dorian had rejected his own brother's biggest opportunity. He did it without a second thought. I had dinner with Dorian 3 times in the 6 months between Conrad's office and the will reading. Sunday lunch with Suzanne twice. I brought wine. I asked the right questions. I gave Dorian nothing. No coldness, no warmth withdrawn, no indication that anything in my world had moved by a single degree. This was not performance. It was precision. I had spent 40 years understanding what was load-bearing in a structure and what wasn't. My composure during those 6 months was load-bearing. The moment I showed Dorian anything, suspicion, knowledge, anger, he would adjust. He would contact Marsh, find another angle. So I gave him nothing to sense. At the third dinner, Dorian reached across the table and put his hand on mine. He said he was glad I was well. He said the cardiac event had frightened him. And the thing that undid me, not broke me, but undid me, just for a moment, was that I genuinely couldn't tell whether he meant it. I want to go back to the Thursday 11 months earlier when Conrad rang me. He said, "Walter, there's a document from your recovery period I'd like you to look at with me in person." I drove to Canary Wharf the next morning. He placed the document in front of me and pointed to a clause in the third paragraph. He asked whether I remembered discussing it specifically. I read it. I told him I remembered Dorian at my hospital bed with a folder, pointing to the signature line, explaining it was a standard renewal of management authority. Nothing consequential. Conrad said, "This clause doesn't renew authority. It creates new authority. It gives the named advisor discretion to restructure arrangements without further approval for 36 months. 36 months. Described as a standard renewal. Signed by a man who was medicated, tired, and grateful his son was showing up. I sat in Conrad's office for a long time. Then I asked whether he knew a good forensic accountant. He wrote Paulette Sheridan's name on a notepad without saying another word. 3 days before the will reading, I drove back to Coventry one last time. I parked in the yard entrance and sat with the engine off, watching my son work. The way he moved across the ground, the way the men around him tracked his position without being asked to. I took out my phone and photographed him through the windscreen. Not posed, not aware. Just working. Just being exactly what he had built himself into without a single thing from me. I printed it that evening and took it to Conrad's office the following morning. I asked him to place it on the table at the end of the reading, after the envelopes, after every door had closed on everything my other children had been counting. I wanted it to be the last thing in that room. Conrad looked at the photograph, then placed it carefully in the folder. "Walter," he said, "this one is going to be different." I picked up my jacket. "I know," I said. "That's the point." It was the morning of the will reading. I was in my kitchen at 6:15, dressed, tea made, gray wool jacket on the chair. My phone rang. An unfamiliar number. A man's voice, flat and unhurried. The tone of someone who had moved beyond patience into something permanent. He said he was calling about an outstanding obligation involving my son. The resolution date was Friday. He trusted the matter was being managed. I sat with the phone to my ear without speaking. Then I said I would pass the message along. I put the phone down. I picked up my tea. I thought about Dorian getting dressed in his Kensington flat, carrying the specific fragile hope of a man who believed today was the day everything finally resolved. I thought about what that hope was going to feel like in 4 hours. I finished my tea. I put on my jacket. In the car, a text arrived from Dorian. 3 words. "See you there." I read it twice, put the phone in my jacket, and drove. I arrived at Hale and Partners 11 minutes early. 2 minutes later, I heard them, Dorian and Suzanne, voices carrying the easy confidence of people walking toward a conclusion they believed was already arranged. The conference room door didn't close fully. I could hear every word. Dorian was on his phone. He said handled 3 times and has agreed twice. The loose relief of a man who believed the difficult part was behind him. Then Suzanne, not on a call, talking through numbers quietly. The company valuation, the property addresses, the investment total. Figures she should not have known unless she had access documentation. She was never given. I sat in my chair, folded my hands, breathed. I let my 40 years of work wash over me, itemized by my daughter in a room where she was waiting for me to come hand it to her. I didn't feel anger. I felt grief. The specific grief of a man who had hoped he had been wrong about what his children were. I hadn't been wrong. I stood, straightened my jacket, pushed open the door, walked in. Conrad began at 2 o'clock precisely. He read, without performance, The measured cadence of a man who understood the words carried sufficient weight, without embellishment. The company, 6.8 million. I watched Dorian's knee stop bouncing. The properties, 2.1 million. I watched Suzanne wrap, both hands around her coffee cup. The investment accounts, 890,000, 9.4 million. The number they had been living inside for 2 years. The number that was going to resolve everything. Conrad paused. He turned a page. The entirety of the estate has been transferred into the Morrow-Briggs settlement, a discretionary trust established 11 months ago. The named successor trustee and primary beneficiary is... This was the moment I had been building toward for 11 months. I looked at my son. I looked at my daughter. Conrad said the name. Cale Morrow-Briggs. The room went silent. I could hear the river 14 floors below. I could hear my own heart beating steadily, repaired, working mine. Conrad finished reading. Dorian was still standing, hand flat on the table, using the surface to hold himself upright. Suzanne hadn't moved. Conrad placed 2 envelopes on the table, my handwriting on each. Dorian tore his open and read. I watched the moment he reached a line about his debt. 280,000 pounds settled in full. Both lenders paid 6 weeks earlier. His shoulders dropped. 1 second of pure physical relief. Then he read the next line. His debt had been cleared not as a gift, but as a severance. A father making sure his son was safe, then stepping back and closing the space between them for the last time. The relief drained from his face. Suzanne folded her letter, placed it in her bag, walked to the door, stopped with her hand on the frame. 3 full seconds. Then she walked out. Dorian was still at the table when Conrad placed the photograph down. A man in a hard hat, his half-brother. The man who had received everything Dorian spent 2 years trying to take. He folded his letter, left without speaking. The photograph stayed on the table. Paulette's referral to the Financial Conduct Authority landed at the end of the week. No announcement, no warning to Marsh. Just a formal file from a former HMRC examiner who knew exactly how these documents needed to be structured. The FCA opened the investigation within 10 days. The scope expanded to the full pattern. 17 clients, 23 million pounds, 6 years. Marsh's practicing license was suspended. His Mayfair office closed without ceremony. One morning, locked door, blank website, voicemail nobody would return. Dorian rang Marsh 4 times in one afternoon. No answer. The 5th time the call didn't connect. He had no creditors, no inheritance. A clean slate he had done nothing to deserve, and a letter signed with one name, Walter. What he chose to do next was no longer mine to influence. I had decided that was appropriate. He rang on a Thursday evening, 8 days after the will reading. I held the phone and looked at his name for a long time before I answered. His voice was different from any version I had heard across the 6 months of careful dinners. The composure was gone, not into anger, but into something rawer and younger. He sounded like the boy he had been before the debt. He didn't apologize. He didn't explain. He asked one question: why had I paid the debt? I told him the truth, that those men were dangerous and he was still my son, and I would not leave him to that consequence regardless of what he had done. That there's a difference between what a man deserves and what a father can bring himself to do. A long silence. Then, I didn't know about Cale. I told him I knew. Another silence. Then, the clinic in Shropshire, is that a real recommendation? Yes. I gave him the name. He could use me as a reference. He said, all right. I said, all right. 5 days later, Suzanne sent a text. 2 words, I'm sorry. I typed a reply, deleted it, typed it again, sent it. For words, the door's open. Cale signed the successor trustee documentation on a Friday afternoon in Conrad's office. He came in his work clothes, steel-toe cap boots, Morrow Groundworks jacket, dried cement on the sleeve that he noticed in the lift and didn't apologize for, because it was his work and this was who he was. He read every document in full. 45 minutes. 11 questions. Each precise. Each the question of a man who had learned early that nobody else was to read the small print for him. Conrad answered all 11. Then Cale picked up his own pen, the one he used to mark drawings and sign off timesheets, and signed his full legal name, Cale Morrow Briggs. He didn't rush the letters. They shook hands. Cale walked to the door, stopped, turned back. My father, is he all right? Conrad told him Walter was well, and that the door on Maple Lane was not locked. Cale nodded once and walked out. The following Monday, the overdue yard lease cleared. The ground worker who had handed in his notice was back by Wednesday. Morrow Groundworks kept its name, its address, its slightly uneven letters on the site boards. What changed was the spreadsheet on the cabin desk that last week had no comfortable answer. Now it had every answer it needed. It was a Thursday morning in late March. Thin, uncommitted British spring light over the West Midlands. I was on a site outside Solihull, a highway drainage scheme that prevented flooding in streets where real people lived. The first joint contract between Briggs Civil and Morrow Groundworks. I was looking at a drainage gradient that slightly concerned me when I heard boots on the ground behind me. The rhythm of a man who covered ground quickly without appearing to hurry. The walk of someone who had been on sites since he was a teenager. I didn't turn around. He stopped beside me. A drawing unfolded. Then Cale said, without greeting, without preamble, in the direct way of a man more comfortable with problems and feelings, the gradient's wrong. I looked at the drawing. He was right. He marked it with his own pen and handed it back. The correction was precise and exactly right. We stood on that ground together for a while, reading the same lines, not saying anything that needed words, because we were both men who understood that the most important things are communicated in the work itself, in showing up, in getting the gradient right. We were not fully reconciled in the clean way these stories are supposed to end. We were two men who shared a last name and a trade and the understanding of people who had both been failed, and both kept building anyway. They sat in that room and divided 40 years of my life before I'd finished living it. They counted every building, every property, every pound, except the one person I had spent 34 years failing to count myself. That was their mistake, and it was mine first. The difference is I still had time to correct it if this story resonated with you. Please hit the like button, subscribe to this channel, and share it with someone who needs to hear it. Drop a comment below telling me, what would you have done in my situation? I read every single one, and your perspective matters to me.